Well, we usually begin our Sunday sessions with a news item, and this comes from our great sustaining publication for harm reduction and good thinking about drugs and addiction, Filter. In the most recent issue I have, San Francisco drug users face soaring deaths. That's the headline. The second part of that is, I know solidarity can sustain us. How do you interpret that second part, Zach? Can you make sense of, I know solidarity can sustain us? What does that say to you?
I mean, literally, it means if we all work together, well, we'll be good. We'll be good to go. But I assume that there's a certain kind of solidarity that's being asked, rather than a solidarity meaning we'll listen to really everybody.
You know, when you replace me totally, you're going to do you're going to do a good job, Zach. I mean, it's making a warm personal statement. Solidarity can sustain us. We're a group of people. We're sympathetic to drug users. The person writing it has some involvement in that community.
Yeah.
And we do want to extend community. That's good for all of us. But I think your inclination is right. In a way, they're saying, well, we have a way of approaching this. We're going to keep at it. And,
right.
That brings up, I'm just going to read the next line here. This is in San Francisco. And San Francisco is a harm reduction capital of the world. I interviewed Jeannie Little and Pat Denning, the great Pat Denning, who I love. And they're pioneers in the field. Although during that interview, maybe you recall, when I sort of asked about the status of harm reduction versus abstinence in AA in the Bay Area, Pat was she said, you'd be surprised even out here. There's a lot of traditional thinking.
Yeah.
And I would trace that back to this. Well, before I do that, let me give the next line. By August, this is the news item, they've only just now reckoned with the third quarter. By August, the overdose toll for 2020 in San Francisco had already matched 2019's total. And 2019 was a record year after a slight kickback in 2018. We're not in any way ringing a bell for that. We're as depressed as everybody is by that. That's our purpose in life. But the solidarity they're speaking about, why is AA and abstinence still strong? The argument we often make, that I make, and I think you understand it, is the concept of addiction is a disease that can be treated outside of dealing with the human being and the community is just as American as apple pie, and we never can escape that. And as we've reiterated, MAT is a part and parcel of that. So when you say solidarity says, well, that's a certain solidarity, I think what you're saying is, well, they've got an approach and they're going to stick to it. And so the latest news, as in all news this year and last year, is that what we're doing, maybe I won't go so far as to say it's not working. It's certainly not reversing the tide.
That's how are we doing? Yeah, 3 words that you always say that really holds a mirror to all statements about how we have the best ideas and best technologies now. How are we doing? Or 4 words, depending on whether you use an apostrophe or not. And it's really hard to answer that question honestly and positively at the same time. You ask, the goal is to try to eliminate drug fatalities or get close to it or help people prevent addiction. And you ask, okay, how are we doing? It's not so good, reflected by this article.
And it's consistent with everything we've heard going in. And why is that? And we have to get under the hood, and that's what we're trying to do. We're our own mechanics on this. And, sometimes we're not the most popular people in the world in doing that. but we feel we have to do it. So there's another current event that we're going to turn to, which ties into love addiction. I know you had some thoughts on that. Just after some FKA Twigs has sued her boyfriend, Shia Labeouf. Just after Valentine's Day in 2019, the musician FKA Twigs was in the car speeding towards LA. At the wheel was her boyfriend, the actor Shia Labeouf. He was driving recklessly. She said in a lawsuit filed on Friday, this is December 11th, removing his seatbelt and threatening to crash unless she professed her love for him.
Yeah.
So it doesn't, we're going to get into his substance use, but it doesn't seem as though he's intoxicated with a substance. He's driving ably, but crazily. They were returning from the desert where Mr. Labeouf, the star of Transformers, had raged at her throughout the trip, FKA Twigs said in the lawsuit, once waking her up in the middle of the night, choking her. After she begged to be let out of the car, she said he pulled over at a gas station and she took her bags from the trunk. But Mr. Labeouf followed and assaulted her, throwing her against the car while screaming in her face, according to the suit. He then forced her back into the car. The gas station incident is the heart of a lawsuit. It says Mr. Labeouf, 34, abused FKA Twigs physically, emotionally, and mentally many times in a relationship that had lasted just short of a year. Her aim in coming forward, she said in an interview, was to explain how even a critically acclaimed artist with money, a home, and strong network of supporters could be caught in such a cycle. What, you had a reaction to hearing this story initially. Can you summon that up again?
My reaction was kind of reinforcement because I had thought about Shia LaBeouf in the past. I thought about him because he talks about his struggles with, alcohol addiction or drug addiction and his ways of abstaining from those things. And then I remember him telling, sort of on the same interview, a story about sexcapades, I'll just say. Women he's been with, weird things that he's done. And I thought, I don't know what his problem was with drugs or alcohol, but I have a hunch that he's talking about having been addicted to those things because it's kind of fashionable to do so. When you're developing out of some cycle of behavior, you could say, I was bogged down by drugs or alcohol. Now I'm in long-term recovery, I think might have been and so now I'm progressing.
And he talked about that. He said he was in recovery.
Right. But I remember thinking, it sounds like the thing that was really bogging him down are his relationships. I won't give anything away right now. You'll turn it probably to love addiction.
Go ahead.
But just relationships in general for him seem to be the blind spot of his entire life. And now hearing this, it just sort of reinforces it in an interesting way.
It's almost like a proof of your hypothesis. If you were working with him, you'd say, well, I'm glad you're in recovery, but relationships seem to be very central to your psychology.
Right.
And he's driving crazily, threatening to kill himself and her, unless she says, do you recall what it said in the article?
Unless she said that she loved him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that a funny fix?
Yeah.
It's a fix.
Yeah.
It's the most powerful. Obviously, somebody would ask him, if you threaten to kill somebody and they say you love you, that's not 100% kosher. What do you really think that's all about? But it expresses the dynamic of an addictive relationship, especially an abusive one, where one person's a victim and one person's an abuser. So let me just give a little further explanation of what that kind of an addiction's like. There's more information from another site that I got, and it says that during the course of their relationship, he refused to allow her to talk to anybody else. He got extremely jealous if she talked to a male waiter. And then people always ask in a situation like this, I mean, there are two players in this relationship, and she's got money. She's successful in her own right. She has her own townhouse in London. And people asked her, well, why didn't you go back there? And her answer was, I was so stripped of any feeling of agency, of my ability to help myself, that I was like prone, which is, it's interesting to think about that when you think about, well, when somebody's really in the throes of a drug or an alcohol addiction, they feel what? You know, the drugs and the alcohol have all these effects, but they feel demoralized. They feel they can't do anything to help themselves. And that's the most powerful feeling, because what we're asking is, why does a person in an abusive relationship who's got resources, it's not a poor woman who doesn't have any place to go, remain in it anyhow, in a way that's more puzzling than the Labeouf behavior, because we can try and understand why it is that he needs that feeling so badly that he'll kill. And, you know, I've said before, the last time we talked about love addiction, I said, if a drug causes as much suicide and murder, and no drug causes as much suicide and murder as love, it would be banned. And he's sort of trying, you know, people do. That came up in our discussion of Peter Bogdanovich, the woman he was involved with, her actual husband killed her and then committed suicide. So those two things, it wasn't like he was getting, oh, here, this will show you. They both died. And this is what he was trying to do. So he is trying to control her to get a feeling of being loved. It's a need for something so great that he'll be violent, hurt her, risk killing her and risk death. And her behavior is just as patterned, as uninhibited. She's in a pile of her own ego, and it's almost like you imagine her melting like the Wicked Witch. She ceased to be a full human being. It's almost like he's taking her like a drug, like he's melting her down and injecting her.
I have two. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. You go.
I have two questions for you on that. One, if I recall, I mean, I know you, so this is cheating, but if I recall from your book, Love and Addiction, you know, love is the worst addiction in your mind. And I have come to agree with you over the years. And one of the reasons that you give is because it takes two, kind of a thing. If you are procuring a drug and you will forego all of the other interesting things or positive possibilities in your life for the sake of chasing that dragon of and that feeling you think that it could provide you and the sense of relief you can give. That's one thing, and that's what addiction is, and that's a destructive cycle. With love addiction, there's necessarily another person involved. And so that interplay is what could be so destructive. Would you say that's fair?
Last night, Tuesday, was the last episode in the Netflix series, The Teacher, where the teacher has an affair with the young man, and it's ruined both their lives. She's in prison. She lost her job, and she was in prison, and she can't get a job because everybody in town calls her a sex predator. And he's preoccupied, and he says, I can't go to school, I can't study, I can't think. It wasn't good for both of them. And it was well done in a lot of ways. And she says, it wasn't a love relationship, it was an escape for both of us. And then she said to him, he's 18, so it's not illegal technically. She said to him, go out and be a kid. But I was sweating bullets because, you know, you empathize. They're both nice people. Even her, I hope I'm not saying anything bad, like I'm sympathizing with the sexual predator. But what's great about the series is it really gives you an internal look at both of their lives and their feelings and the punishments they endure. And he's now come over at the very last session. He's come over to see her, and I'm sweating bullets because, you know, I want her to get better. and he starts to caress her, and drugs won't do that. You know what I mean? You still have to go out and get the heroin. You know what I mean? You still have to get a bottle of booze. They don't message you and then drive over to your house and then caress you. Somebody might say, oh, it does. It's caressing, the memories are caressing me. Maybe. But an actual human being, and she does, well, I better not give anything away. I was sweating bullets. I was saying, oh my God, she hasn't shown any ability to show good judgment or resistance before. This is really impossible to avoid. So it is important to understand that a love addiction has two parties. When people are watching the Jerry Springer show and one woman gets up and says, oh, he beats me and he cheats on me, and everybody says, kick that zero to the curb and everything like that, of course, we're thinking.
I think that you and I will wonder and just be honestly curious about why tolerate that much abuse before doing something about it, or why
and she's still not doing something about it. She'll argue with them.
Right.
And so the questions we would ask are so simple-minded. The kinds of questions we ask in Life Process Program, we say, excuse me, do you have a job or any life skills?
Right.
Where are you educationally? Do you have friends? How are your connections with your family? And of course, that comes out in the Labeouf story.
Yes.
An abuser, okay, beating a person, that's abuse. Everybody threatening their lives is abuse. But the scarier part of the abuse is when they refuse to let the person talk to their sister or their mother.
Right.
Or the crazy part of it is when he becomes enraged because she talks to a male waiter. Then you go, well, that's crazy. And so as a therapy technique, the same as we would do with somebody who's addicted to heroin. I mean, obviously, the person's got a problem that we would focus on. But the woman, we would say, what's your life structure like? What are your values, your purpose, your intimate community relationships, your skill level? What have you done successfully in the past? All of the questions that we would engage in with Life Process Program, we would do in that situation. So we've touched on the drug death epidemic in San Francisco, how it never recedes. Obviously, the pandemic has some impact on that, but it's been a trend straight through from 2019 that what we're doing, we have to rethink. And we're segueing into Labeouf is in recovery. Recovery from what? He's not in recovery from addiction. You know, I don't want to be glib, but you want to say, well, if he drank or took some drugs, at least he's not almost assassinating somebody and ruining another human being's life.
Right. I won't tell you who said it, but somebody that we know and people who are viewing might know or be aware of said to me one time about entering an AA meeting, and maybe it was third or fourth meeting, and said, if being sober means being like you assholes, then, you know, pour me a drink.
When I give a workshop at Above and Beyond in Chicago, there are people who are in the bottom end of the social totem pole, and I love them because they Above and Beyond and Dan Hostetler, my great friend who's the CEO, help those people. But they all know what love addiction is. If I say, have you ever been in a relationship that was as harmful to you as drugs and alcohol, and yet you persisted in that? And this is men and women. Do you know what I'm saying? And how are you around my saying that's addictive? Everybody, they're kind of addiction experts, and they all know what we're getting at. Yeah. We've done our current events. We've done love addiction. We've done current events with love addiction, which is never out of the news. We could easily find something each week, but for somebody to actually sue a major league star for abusing her, which God bless her, If somebody commits a crime against you, go ahead. You know, Nicole Simpson should have done that to O.J. Simpson before he killed her.
Now, I have a question for you on the other end, the abuser side. We were saying if we were looking clinically at the person who's being abused and speaking with them, we might. I said it wrong. That's what I meant, though. We would want to know what seems to be preventing you from doing something about this. Obviously, you don't love the abuse, so what's going on? And we'd figure out.
And we'd explore. You know, I hate to get psychological. Why do you put up with it? We don't want to get down on the abuse victim.
Right.
We can't do that, but we would say, why do you put up with this? You've talked to our great colleague Ann Earl, who has two lovely children. I would say to Ann Earl, I don't think this could happen to your daughter. I have two daughters. As far as I'm aware, and I won't say I know everything, obviously. They both have partners now and they both have jobs. That's never happened to them, and it couldn't happen to them. And I would say I had a wife who raised those two girls, those two women now, 30s and 40s. And I would say, what is it, and I would think Ann Earl would agree with me, what is it that prevented the two of you, my daughters and her daughter, from having this experience? And again, we're not putting down people who have this experience, because all of our daughters are privileged. Obviously, they have to care about themselves and their health. They have to understand what real intimacy is and to understand what a sharing relationship is. Both my daughters have partners, long-term partners, thank God, or bless their hearts. Both of them have careers. Both of them pride themselves in their skills. Both of them are achievers. And my wife and I both made it clear that we valued accomplishment, that we wanted our children all to have goals and to be gifted, able at what they did. We weren't that concerned about if they scored great in the gift department. We wanted them to be able to do something well and to be invested in something that's good, that you feel good about doing, that other people admire, that's socially valued. That's the best antidote to addiction.
So when it comes to love addiction, somebody in that position is probably either has a lack of attractive alternatives to being with that person, or they have a lack of access to attractive alternatives to being with the person, or they have a lack of understanding how to feel self-worth without that person. And that can be scaffolded.
Those are your, if you want to raise a non-addicted child, which we deal with outgrowing addiction, and which I wrote a book, Addiction Proof Your Child, those are the most important components to instill in a young person. And love, you going?
Nah, you should keep going. You're on a roll.
Well, love for a child, we understand, at least theoretically, for the most part, although there was another Netflix series where a woman had a child who was disabled, and she refused to let the child ever have any kinds of exposure to anybody outside of her. So parents are capable of that kind of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, what Labeouf did to his partner is something that virtually every parent is aware they shouldn't do to their child. And virtually every parent is more or less aware that your job in loving a child is to allow them to grow beyond you, to exceed their boundaries, and to develop. We have a development model of addiction, to be their full selves. And so in a way, in a strange way, how love expresses itself for a child is really a paradigm for love of all kinds.
When you and I, turning to Shia Labeouf now, when you and I talk about helping people at all, we have to put ourselves, well, I guess we don't have to, but we decide to put ourselves in the mindset that if we were given the same life elements and circumstances, we could imagine ourselves making those decisions. Like, you could see where it would be possible to make those decisions. It's not because there's a bug in your brain telling you to do it or making you do it.
It's a very human reaction that we recognize. And I've never driven a car trying to kill myself in somebody. It's not in me. I mean, I've taken some risks, but I've never intentionally tried to hurt myself in somebody who I say I love. I couldn't do that. But we all recognize some aspect of that behavior, some desperate desire for wanting to be loved so that you force another person into a category or behavior that you need, but that's not coming out of them.
Now, you and I, this is famous in my mind, had a conversation on a podcast about Harvey Weinstein. And, only the past few years while we were writing our book, did I really recognize the wisdom that you were trying to portray. And we had a disagreement, I think, but you were trying to tell me we don't have a disagreement. You're not seeing the bigger picture in a really nice way. So what I was saying was that isn't there sort of like a differential kind of a thing you might say about Harvey Weinstein rather than, well, he has a love addiction. Maybe you say he's like a narcissist or something like that. And you're kind of saying, well, tomato, tomato, this could be one and the same. But really, if you look at the bigger picture, and discuss what's actually changeable about a person, developable about a person, you're going to want to look at the basic elements, not a diagnosis that pins them in one section or another. Would you say that's true about this case?
Well, narcissist is a word that, I don't, neither of us likes to use labels. You don't like to use labels with kids. They're limiting, they're demoralizing. When we talk about Harvey Weinstein, we have to declare right up front that criminal behavior and rape is punishable as appropriate. And Harvey Weinstein's in prison, and he belongs in prison.
Yeah.
We're not his therapist. I understand he did go to a love addiction clinic, but part of what he was after, in addition to whatever, power, control, and sexual gratification, seemed to be wanting to have people admire and love him. That was part of what he was after in those relationships. And, Shia Labeouf killed that woman. It's murder.
Yeah.
And if you murder, and O.J. Simpson murdered his ex-wife. Murder is murder. There's no discussion about dealing with that. But if we were a death row psychologist with them, or not a death row, a life in prison, or if we're a psychologist working with an abuser, we would need to explore their motivations. What is it that they're seeking?
Right.
In controlling and harming and limiting another human being.
Everyone have a happy Sunday, and please tune into the screen that I think is going to pop up right around now, which will take you to a Q&A video, which I'm going to put up weekly or as long as we can withstand it. And if you want to ask questions for Stanton, join the LPP Facebook discussion group or follow on Twitter or subscribe to the YouTube channel. And thanks and happy Sunday.